There is a version of you that people stop testing. Stop challenging. Stop undermining. Stop targeting. Not because you fought them. Not because you threatened them. Not because you explained yourself, proved yourself, or convinced them of anything. Because you made yourself not worth the cost. Machiavelli called it the most secure position a prince could occupy. And right now, I am going to show you exactly how to build it. This is not about confidence. Confidence is something you feel on good days and lose on bad ones. It depends on conditions. It depends on how others respond to you. It depends on whether the last thing that happened to you was a win or a loss. What Machiavelli described in The Prince was something categorically different. Not confidence, architecture. The systematic construction of a psychological and behavioral position so stable, so internally coherent, so indifferent to the assessments of others, that the people who once spent energy undermining you simply stopped. Not because they became good people. Because you became an unprofitable target. In Chapter 19 of The Prince, one of the most strategically precise chapters ever written, Machiavelli stated his conclusion plainly: the prince who is not hated and not despised has done everything necessary. When he is not hated and not despised, private citizens will not have the courage to conspire against him. Read that again. Not loved, not hated, and not despised. The untouchable position is not built on being liked. It is built on making attack unprofitable. This is not a theoretical framework. Every principle I am about to give you has been demonstrated, repeatedly, by real people in real circumstances across for centuries of documented history. 7 laws. 7 stories. 7 positions you can begin building from wherever you are right now. This is your map. Keep building it. Let us begin. Law 1, the economy of reaction. The person who reacts least controls the most. Machiavelli wrote that the bond of love is broken whenever it serves the interest of the other, but fear, maintained by the dread of punishment, never leaves. Most people misread this as an argument for cruelty. It is not. It is an argument for stability. What Machiavelli was identifying was a fundamental asymmetry in human power dynamics. The person whose behavior is predictable can be manipulated. The person whose emotional responses can be triggered can be controlled. The person who reacts visibly, consistently, and proportionally to every provocation has handed their opponent the most valuable intelligence possible, the complete map of their psychological threshold. The real story. In 1961, John F. Kennedy faced one of the most humiliating foreign policy failures in American presidential history, the Bay of Pigs invasion. A CIA-backed operation to overthrow Fidel Castro collapsed completely. 1,400 Cuban exiles captured. The United States exposed as the architect of a failed coup. The international press was merciless. Congress was furious. Advisors expected Kennedy to deflect, to blame the CIA, to point at the previous administration's plan. Kennedy called a press conference. He stood in front of the world's media and said, "There's an old saying that victory has 100 fathers and defeat is an orphan. I am the responsible officer of the government." He took complete ownership. No deflection. No visible distress. No reactive justification. His approval rating went up 12 points. Not because people agreed with what happened. Because the man who does not react defensively when attacked signals something the human brain registers immediately and involuntarily: this person has nothing to hide and nothing to prove. When you react, emotionally, defensively, immediately, you reveal the outline of your wound. You show the room exactly where to press. Every opponent you will ever face is watching for that outline. They cannot use what they cannot find. Kennedy understood, intuitively, what Machiavelli had formalized 5 centuries earlier. The person who absorbs attack without visible disruption does not appear weak. They appear invulnerable. An invulnerability, real or perceived, is the first layer of the untouchable position. Begin the practice today. The next time someone provokes you, take 4 seconds before responding. In those 4 seconds, decide whether your response serves you or them. Most of the time, silence serves you more completely than any answer could. The person who makes you react has taken temporary ownership of your mind. Charge rent, or evict them. Law 2, the fortress of self-knowledge. Your enemies can only use what you haven't already faced. Machiavelli wrote that the prince who has built his own fortress well does not need to fear siege, because his walls make the cost of attack greater than the potential reward. Most people build no fortress. They move through their lives with every insecurity exposed, every wound visible, every need for approval broadcasting at full signal. And they wonder why people use these things against them. The psychological fortress is built from one material and one material only, self-knowledge. The precise, unflinching, detailed understanding of your own weaknesses, your own needs, your own fears, your own patterns. Not so that you can eliminate them, you cannot. But so that nobody else can weaponize them. Because you cannot be destabilized by something you have already confronted. You cannot be threatened with an exposure of something you have already exposed to yourself. The real story. In 1994, Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison after 27 years of incarceration. He had been the most famous political prisoner in the world. He had every reason, by any human standard, for rage, for bitterness, for the visible wound of a man who had lost the best decades of his life to systematic injustice. He walked out smiling. Not performing. Not managing optics. Smiling. In his autobiography, Mandela later wrote that the years in prison had given him something his opponents could never have anticipated: absolute self-knowledge. He had spent 27 years with nothing but his own mind, and he had examined every corner of it. Every fear. Every resentment. Every wound. Every weakness. By the time he emerged, there was nothing left for his enemies to use. He had already used it himself, to build something unassailable. When he became president of South Africa, his political opponents tried repeatedly to destabilize him through personal attacks, through accusations, through provocations designed to reveal the bitterness they assumed must be there. They found nothing. Because he had already processed everything they were trying to deploy. Machiavelli would have recognized this immediately. The prince who knows every weakness in his own walls cannot be surprised by someone who found one of them. He has already built reinforcement there. He has already decided how he will respond. The attack lands on prepared ground. The specific practice: identify the 3 things people most frequently use to undermine you. The criticism that lands hardest. The comparison that stings most. The insecurity that, when touched, makes you defensive or silent or small. Write them down. Look at them. Decide, deliberately, how you will respond the next time they appear. That deliberate decision, made in advance, from a calm position, is the wall. The person who knows themselves completely cannot be defined by someone who knows them partially. That asymmetry is the fortress. Law 3, the scarcity of presence. What is always available is never valued. What is rarely given cannot be ignored. Machiavelli wrote that the prince should make himself rare. He should appear at the great moments, the moments that matter, and be absent from the trivial ones. His presence should carry the weight of significance because it is not constant. This principle is so counterintuitive that most people spend their entire lives doing the opposite, and wondering why they are not taken seriously. They are always available, always responsive, always present, always engaged. They answer immediately, appear at everything, voice opinions on all things, make themselves part of every conversation and every dynamic. And they become furniture. Not because they are unimportant, but because the human brain is neurologically incapable of valuing what it has constant, unlimited access to. Scarcity is not a tactic. It is a fundamental feature of how human value perception operates. The real story: Steve Jobs was fired from Apple in 1985, the company he had co-founded and built. He was publicly humiliated, described by the press as difficult, abrasive, impossible to work with. Apple's board considered him replaceable. For 12 years, he built Next Computers and Pixar. He said almost nothing about Apple. He gave almost no interviews. He was not a constant presence in the technology conversation. He was not positioning himself for a return. He was building. When Apple brought him back in 1997, the company was 90 days from bankruptcy. Jobs walked into the first all-hands meeting as interim CEO and said something that shocked the room. He told them that Apple had lost because it had stopped thinking about what it stood for. The 12 years of absence had done something that no amount of constant presence could have achieved. It had made every word he said carry the weight of someone who did not need to be there. He was not lobbying for attention. He was not managing his reputation. He simply appeared, when the moment required it, with everything he had built in the intervening years. Apple's market capitalization when Jobs returned was $3 billion. Apple's market capitalization the year Jobs died was $347 billion. Machiavelli's principle of presence is not about being mysterious or withholding for effect. It is about the genuine alignment between where you choose to spend your attention and what you actually value. The person who is selective, who appears fully when they appear and is genuinely absent when they are not, creates a different kind of gravity than the person who is always partially available. When you make yourself rare, people stop taking you for granted. When people stop taking you for granted, they start paying attention. That attention is the beginning of authority. Take a moment to reflect. If this framework is clarifying something about why certain people in your life have authority they don't seem to work for, and why some people who work very hard for it never get it, then let's keep going. This is not motivation. This is the map. Now, Law 4. Law 4, the indifference to approval. The person who needs to be liked can always be controlled by the person who withholds liking. The Prince features a psychologically sophisticated chapter titled, How Flatterers Are to Be Avoided. Machiavelli's concern was not with people who say nice things. His concern was with the prince who needs to hear them. Because the prince who needs approval will inevitably surround himself with people who provide it. And the people who provide constant approval are not serving the prince, they are controlling him. They are managing his decisions, his perceptions, and his self-concept through the strategic distribution of validation. This is the most invisible and most common trap in human social dynamics. The real story: in the early 1900s, Andrew Carnegie built the largest steel empire in American history, starting from a Scottish immigrant family with almost nothing. By the time he sold Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan in 1901, the transaction was valued at $480 million, the equivalent of roughly $17 billion today. What very few people know about Carnegie is that during his years of building, he systematically surrounded himself with people who disagreed with him. He had a specific practice. Before making any significant decision, he would present his conclusion to the person in his circle most likely to oppose it, and he would demand the strongest possible argument against it. Not validation, opposition. He paid for honest disagreement the way other executives paid for flattery. When asked about this practice, Carnegie said something that Machiavelli would have recognized immediately: "I am not afraid of men who argue with me. I am afraid of men who agree with me, because they are usually either wrong or dishonest, and I cannot always tell which." The person who does not need approval cannot be controlled through its withholding. The person who actively seeks opposition cannot be misled through false validation. Carnegie's indifference to approval, his systematic preference for truth over comfort, was not a personality trait. It was a deliberate architecture. The practical consequence: he made better decisions than competitors who surrounded themselves with agreement. And he was immune to the most common manipulation available, the manipulation of a person's desire to feel right, to feel liked, to feel endorsed. Machiavelli's warning stands unchanged: surround yourself with those who tell you truth rather than what is pleasant. And be the kind of person who can hear truth without it damaging you. That capacity, the capacity to absorb accurate information regardless of how uncomfortable it is one of the rarest and most powerful positions a person can occupy. The person who needs you to approve of them is already yours. The person who doesn't need your approval is already free. Law 5, the completion of what you begin. Unfinished things announce weakness. Finished things announce something else entirely. Machiavelli wrote one of his most cited and most misunderstood lines: "All the armed prophets succeeded and all the unarmed ones failed." He was not talking about weapons. He was talking about completion. About the presence or absence of genuine internal force, the willingness to see a thing through to its end without the comfort of external approval, without the reassurance of immediate results, without the option of retreat when the process becomes uncomfortable. The person who consistently completes what they begin, at a high standard, without fanfare, builds something that has no equivalent in social currency: a track record. And a track record is the only form of authority that cannot be faked, cannot be argued with, and cannot be taken away. The real story: in 1849, Harriet Tubman escaped from slavery in Maryland, alone, on foot, at night, following the North Star through roughly 90 miles of hostile territory. Most people, having escaped, would have considered the mission complete. They would have stayed north. They would have been justified in every possible sense of the word. Tubman went back 19 times. Over 11 years, she personally guided approximately 70 enslaved people to freedom through the Underground Railroad, operating in the same territory from which she had escaped, under a bounty that eventually reached $40,000. She was never caught. She never lost a passenger. When asked how she maintained the psychological capacity for 19 returns into danger, she said something that has not been adequately analyzed in most accounts of her life: "I never ran my railroad off the track and I never lost a passenger." That line is not pride. It is architecture. Tubman had built a standard, an internal standard, accountable to no one but herself, and she maintained it across 19 operations in 11 years. Not because it was safe. Not because it was approved. Not because it was easy. Because she had decided what she stood for, and she stood for it with a consistency that made stopping conceptually unavailable to her. Machiavelli wrote that the prince who uses his own force, and does not depend on fortune, rarely fails. What he meant was this: the person who acts from internal standard rather than external condition does not stop when conditions become unfavorable. They continue. And the continuation, visible, consistent, indifferent to resistance, is itself the authority. Every abandoned project is an announcement. Every completed one is a different announcement. Choose what you announce. Law 6. The strategic use of opposition. Your enemies are the most accurate map of your position. Learn to read them. Machiavelli wrote that a wise prince will never disarm his subjects, because those who were his enemies when he came to power become his most loyal defenders once he wins them. The opposition is not the problem. How you handle it is. Most people treat opposition as something to eliminate, to silence, to argue away. They spend enormous energy managing what people think of them, issuing corrections, seeking vindication, proving their critics wrong. This is not power. This is management of anxiety. The truly untouchable person does something different with opposition. They read it as intelligence. The real story: Coco Chanel was born in 1883 in Sourma, France, to a street vendor father who placed her in an orphanage when her mother died. She had no connections, no family money, no social position. She was, by every metric of her era, starting from nothing. When she began her fashion career, the established fashion world opposed her at every turn. She was not from the right families. She did not use the right materials. She rejected the corseted silhouettes that had defined women's fashion for a century, proposing instead designs that allowed women to move freely. The fashion establishment said she was wrong. She paid close attention to what, specifically, they criticized. Every criticism told her where the resistance was concentrated, which meant it told her where the existing order felt most threatened. She used the pattern of opposition as a map of where her work was genuinely disrupting something significant. The things that attracted the most violent criticism were the things she developed most deliberately. By the time she launched Chanel No. 5 in 1921, she was the most influential designer in France. By the time she died in 1971, she had transformed how women dressed for the entire 20th century. Machiavelli's insight is precise: the opposition of your enemies tells you more about your position than the agreement of your friends. Because your enemies are paying attention for different reasons, they are tracking what you are doing, what it threatens, what it challenges. They are doing your reconnaissance for you. The person who learns to read opposition as information rather than attack becomes almost impossible to destabilize, because they have converted their opponents into intelligence assets. The person who stops you most aggressively is usually standing closest to what you are about to disrupt. Pay attention. Law 7. The long horizon. Most people overestimate what they can do in a month and underestimate what they can do in a decade. Machiavelli compares fortune to a river. In calm times, the river moves predictably and people forget it can flood. When it floods, it destroys everything in its path, because no one prepared the banks. But the person who digs channels, builds embankments, prepares the structure before the flood comes, that person finds that when fortune rages, it rages through prepared ground. The destruction it causes elsewhere does not reach them. Machiavelli was describing what we now understand as the power of long-horizon thinking. The decision made today whose results will not be visible for 3 years. The habit built this month whose compound effects will not be legible for a decade. The real story: Warren Buffett made his first investment at age 11. By 13 he had filed his first tax return and owned 2 small businesses. By 30 he was a millionaire, significant, but not extraordinary. The extraordinary part: he is 93 years old, and 99% of his wealth was accumulated after his 52nd birthday. This is not a story about genius. Buffett himself has said that his advantage was not intelligence but patience, the willingness to operate on a time horizon that most investors found psychologically intolerable. While others made decisions quarterly, he made decisions that would not resolve for decades. While others reacted to market fluctuations, he considered them irrelevant to a position he had built to last 30 years. He once said, "The stock market is a device for transferring money from the impatient to the patient." Replace stock market with any domain of human endeavor and the sentence remains true. Machiavelli understood this at a geopolitical level. The prince who builds institutions, not just victories, is the prince whose power survives him. Victories are momentary. Institutions are structural. The investment in structure, made slowly, without immediate visible reward, without the applause that accompanies the dramatic gesture, is the investment that compounds into something that no single opponent can dismantle. The untouchable position is not built in a week. It is built in years of consistent decisions made in the direction of who you are trying to become, most of which nobody sees, many of which produce no immediate result, all of which accumulate. Buffett's real advantage was not knowing which stocks to buy. It was building a psychology that could wait for them to become what he knew they would become. That patience, that long horizon, is available to you. Most people choose not to use it. Conclusion: the final correction. 7 laws. 7 real people. 7 positions that are available to you, not as inspiration, but as architecture. Let me tell you what Machiavelli actually believed, beneath the reputation, beneath the centuries of misreading. He was not a cynic. He was a realist. He believed that most people live below their actual capacity because they have organized their lives around managing how they appear to others rather than building something that is genuinely theirs. They spend energy they should be investing, energy on defense, on justification, on the ongoing project of being understood by people who are not paying close enough attention to ever understand them. The untouchable position is not a personality type. It is a set of decisions, made consistently, over time, without requiring external validation to continue making them. The decision to absorb provocation rather than react to it. The decision to know yourself more completely than any opponent could. The decision to be selective with your presence rather than constant. The decision to prefer truth over comfort, from yourself and from others. The decision to finish what you begin, at a standard that is accountable only to you. The decision to read opposition as information rather than attack. The decision to build on a time horizon that most people find psychologically intolerable. Kennedy absorbed the weight of failure without deflecting it. Mandela spent 27 years building self-knowledge that no prison could touch. Jobs became rare enough that his return changed everything. Carnegie preferred accurate disagreement to comfortable agreement. Tubman completed 19 operations because stopping was not a concept she made available to herself. Chanel read her critics' opposition as a map to what she was actually disrupting. Buffett built a psychology that could wait for what he knew was coming. None of them were born untouchable. They built it. Law by law. Decision by decision. In the quiet, without applause, over time. The untouchable position does not announce itself. It is recognized, eventually, by everyone, through the specific quality of a person who has stopped needing recognition to continue. That is the position. Build it. Most people will take the 7 laws they just heard and do nothing with them. Not because they don't want to, Because change requires sustained action on a long horizon, and most people overestimate what they can change in a week and underestimate what they can build in a year. You are still here. Which means you are already operating on a different time horizon than most people. Every week, we decode the precise psychological and philosophical architecture of power, manipulation, and human behavior. The mechanisms that determine who is taken seriously and who is managed. Who has authority and who performs it. The map gets more complete every week. Think sharper. React less. See everything. That is your correction.